going to be talking about adopting a systems thinking mindset and kind of the things that you need to keep in mind in order to integrate systems thinking, as a concept into your work. So just a reminder, I'm Cheryl. I work at Substantial, which is an independent design and development consultancy in Seattle focused on education. I'm also a design educator. So I teach at University of Washington's Human-Centered Design and Engineering School. And lastly, and most importantly, as Uday mentioned, I just wrote a book. It's called Closing the Loop, Systems Thinking for Designers. And it's published by Rosenfeld Media. And at the end of the talk, I'll share a discount code if you're interested in purchasing the book and learning more about systems thinking and how I've integrated it into my own practice. So just to kick off, many of you are familiar with this particular framework. I'm someone whose career has been foundationally impacted by design thinking as a method, as a process, and as a philosophy. And I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with this and use it in your day-to-day work. So this is typically depicted as having 5 steps in the process. Empathize, where you conduct design research to understand a user's context. Define, where you synthesize the findings from your research and define the problem space. Ideate, where you start coming up with potential solutions. And then prototype and test, where you prototype the most promising solutions and you test solutions with real users. But lately, particularly as a design educator, I've been thinking about the shortcomings of the design thinking approach, particularly in the narrow way that we apply it to practitioners, thinking about the direct benefit of use to individual users. I use this cartoon a lot with my students when I give talks. And for those of you who can't see it, it's people sitting in a cave and saying, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. I think this is something that has crossed many of our minds, especially those of us who are working on products at scale. And so in a world with increasing complexity in which we are constantly designing at scale, sometimes the approach, the design thinking approach, seems to fall short. So there's a few distinct issues with continuing to design with a narrow focus on users, which is how design thinking usually gets incorporated into our work, is that we end up focusing on users as basically the primary area of focus. The first is that the user-centered design process does not acknowledge nor address potential harm. So an example that I use a lot is Infinite Scroll. Asa Raskin, who's often credited with, or maybe I guess blamed for the concept of Infinite Scroll, has said, one of my lessons from Infinite Scroll is that optimizing something for ease of use does not mean best for the user or humanity. Oftentimes we're talking about things like designing for delight, and what this means is that it does not necessarily lead to good outcomes. I was really excited to hear Greg talking at length about outcomes, because I think we as designers often think about like the output of our work rather than outcomes, and so that's an important connection to make. The second issue, a user-centered approach limits the potential impact of design. So rather than using our creativity and empathy-driven practice to apply to bigger issues, we end up applying our skills to things like Infinite Scroll or adhering to maintaining the status quo of power and incentives. So Erica Hall tweeted this image of an anglerfish in 2020, and I think it so well captures how UX is often used to use behavioral design to lure people into business models that are not good for them, or that better serve shareholders rather than end users. And lastly, a user-centered process does not inherently take into account systemic forces. There's a series of Medium articles by the designer Chris Alawa that he wrote in, I want to say 2016, where he talks about designers who design from Africa, or designers who design for Africa without having the context of living or understanding Africa as a socioeconomic location. So he discusses the failure of the XO laptop, the device from the famed One Laptop Per Child initiative in the early 2000s. And this initiative failed for a myriad of reasons. One key reason is that designers and distributors did not understand the context of ownership. And one of the things that he says is that the XO laptop was rejected by adults in African economies because it focused on empowering one child as opposed to providing value to a family or entire community. So this is a really good example of how we often don't take into account these systemic forces when we're designing. So how can we be more intentional about incentives and outcomes? We need to have ways of designing between what we have, which is the status quo, and on this slide, the current reality, and what we want, which is a vision, mission, and values, personally as well as within our organizations. So in between that space is creative tension in which we can drive change. So by aligning stakeholders on what is happening in the system and what needs to be addressed, and also being explicit about both ends of the space, you can drive change in a more meaningful way. So one approach to that is through incorporating systems thinking. So thinking about systemic systems forces, or systems forces us to consider beyond the direct benefit of use. So this means going beyond individual users, their context, and their use of products and services. So how can we consider the systemic impact of our work? This is a description from Donella Meadows on what a system is. So in order to apply systems thinking, we need to have a good understanding of what a system is. And the way she describes it is that a system is more than a sum of its parts. It may exhibit adaptive, dynamic, goal-seeking, self-preserving, and sometimes evolutionary behavior. So it's essentially an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. And this is based on essentially the decisions that the stakeholders make within the system. And they could have incentives that cause a system to work in a certain way. And in order to understand systems, you need to apply systems thinking, which is, as I mentioned earlier, mindset is a way of looking at the world. So a way to think about systems in the context of your work as a designer, you can expand your thinking in 3 ways. The first is interconnectedness. The second is causality, and the third is wholeness. These concepts are the basis for a designer who wants to adopt a systems thinking mindset. And I'll kind of talk about each of these throughout the principles that I'm about to present. So adopting a systems thinking mindset, it means thinking in a more expansive way, fundamentally. One of the metaphors that I really like is from the philosopher Karl Popper, who in the 70s wrote about 2 types of problems, cloud problems and clock problems. So he describes clocks as the kinds of problems that have clear elements that work together. And you can take it apart, break down those elements in order to understand how they work. You can take a series of components and build a clock and make it work, but you can also take apart a broken clock and isolate the problem. So you can essentially reduce the problem and the components. And this is oftentimes described as systems engineering or hard systems methodology. Clouds, on the other hand, can't be taken apart. They're literally nebulous. They move, they're dynamic. They're like complex systems with many aspects that affect each other. So clouds are systems that adapt and change, and there are forces that cause them to change as well. And the thing is, as designers, we often work within engineering cultures, and technology organizations have cultures that stem from engineering. And we end up taking the same reductionist view that the things we're working on are clocks, that they are all things that can be like really easily componentized. But with increasing scale, complexity, and interdependency, we need to live in the clouds. And from my view, there are 3 objectives to adopting a systems thinking mindset. So let's get into it. The first is making the invisible visible. Engaging in systems thinking means trying to first, like, quote unquote, see systems. Oftentimes they exist in your day-to-day and we don't really recognize it. So I'm going to share an example just from like day-to-day life. So there's this great story from 2021 in National Geographic that focused on the unequal distribution of trees in some cities. So For example, in LA, you can have an area with almost no trees. And in others, you have lots of trees. And these two images are on the same street. So when there are heat waves, trees in neighborhoods can actually cool surface temperatures by up to 25 degrees Celsius. And if you think about these neighborhoods in LA, for example, they have very different demographics. The area in the first image is in Koreatown, and it's mostly a Latino and Asian neighborhood, while Los Feliz in the second picture is mostly white. And not only that, but areas with fewer trees not only have lower property value because trees contribute to higher property value as well, but can be deadly in heat waves, as I mentioned earlier. So these disparate paths are formed by discriminatory attitudes that some people are worth more than others. I mean, that's like a fundamental mindset that then connect to structures, policies that reinforce and codify racism and discrimination. And we can look at that as a way of like reinforcing those mindsets. So for example, one of the reasons there are fewer trees in some neighborhoods in LA is because fewer trees make those neighborhoods easier to surveil from helicopters. So the lack of trees are a visible form of discrimination. And this is all made visible by noticing that trees are just in some places and not others. All of these things are connected. So for example, the previous illustration about trees has different layers of decision making as well as impact. When you're analyzing problem states, you can think of the various factors in the STEEP framework. This is sociocultural, technological, environmental, economic, and political. These aspects, anything that's a complex problem space, you're going to have some context around these categories. And it's worth kind of using these categories as a way of analyzing a problem space. I really like something that Greg said earlier at the end of his talk, where he said, people who understand the problem best are set up to do the best work. And I think that really applies to systems thinking, in that systems thinking is a way to really understand a problem space beyond your direct purview of wherever your problem solving lies. So in addition, you can figure out the root cause of why things are the way they are. The iceberg model is a good way to make the invisible visible. At the top of the iceberg is what's most visible to the eye. And this is an example from a project of mine where we were kind of looking at the impact of algebra in math education and how it affects specifically Black and Latino students in the US. And so you have events at the top, and then below that, you have these layers, patterns, trends, structure, and mental models. And what this does is it opens up problem solving to these other areas and not just the events. I think oftentimes in our work, we're solving for things that are actually symptoms of issues that lie below the surface. And so we can think about mental models such as discrimination, etc. And those are built into structures that work their way up to events that present themselves as problems to us. So secondly, remember that today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. Outcomes of change can be both intended and unintended. So work to define how one thing leads to another and where circularity exists. This is actually a saying, today's problems come from yesterday's solutions, is saying from Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, which is a foundational work in systems thinking and organizational change management. And it's something that I think we could all use as designers as kind of reminders that there's no kind of silver bullet problem solving. So let's talk about incentives and unintended consequences for a minute. In 1902, French colonial Hanoi had a rat problem, and this was due to the colonist government trying to bring civilization by building houses and toilets for just the French residents, by the way. And in order to do that, they built miles of sewer pipes where rats in the tropical heat thrived. So that government tried to create a plan to eradicate the rat population. So their solution was to hire local Vietnamese residents as rat hunters and paying them for each dead rat tail turned in. So counter to their intent, the number of rat tails being turned in kept increasing day by day, and come to find that the residents were not only cutting the tails and letting the rats live, they were also farming rats in the countryside to turn them in for a bounty. This is oftentimes called the cobra effect, which is a reference to cobra breeding in another colonized economy, which is India in the 19th century. So it's a story about how people can be incentivized in a way that thwarts the outcomes you're seeking, particularly in complex systems that have many different factors, including a strong power differential between people in the system. So you can kind of sense that in addition to collecting bounties, the rat farming and harvesting were a way for the Vietnamese locals of sticking it to the man, basically. Like the brutally oppressive colonial government, like this is their way of taking some charge and taking some control. Now here's a causal loop about the Great French colonial rat hunt. So causal loops are a core part of systems thinking. And what it does is it helps you acknowledge that sometimes solutions feed themselves back into system and create system forces of their own. So you can see at the top here, there's an increase in the rat population. Then there's an increase in the bounty per rat. There's an increase in rat farming, which leads to an increase in the rat population. So these things are often circular. And this is a really good thing to acknowledge if you're adopting a systems thinking mindset, is that these things feed back into each other. So how does this apply to the types of thing many of us are working on? If you're working on digital technology products and services, there are lots of potential unintended consequences, automation and job displacement, misinformation spread, privacy and data security issues, genetic engineering and bioethics issues, environmental impact of clean technologies. This could be like battery disposal from electric vehicles, and algorithmic bias. And by the way, these are the answers that ChatGPT gave me. So we can think about the unintended consequences of technology, telling us about the unintended consequences of technology. Basically, thinking about how the way we think we're solving problems that leads to other problems is a good way to keep our collective arrogance in check and to put us in the mindset of creating opportunities to mitigate the new problems as well as innovate to potentially prevent them. So the sort of third sort of mindset to keep in mind is diversify and empower your stakeholders. I was recently reading Prince Harry's biography. Yes, I had like my sort of guilty pleasure is reading celebrity biographies, but there was an interesting piece in the New Yorker by his ghostwriter. And the ghostwriter said something along the lines of empathy is a thin gruel compared to the marrow of experience. And I think about this all the time when I consider who we are as designers and what we bring to the table. You have positionality as a designer. This starts with knowing who you are, your powers and biases, and that they're not agnostic to the problem space. Boone, who's about to speak next, has said, designers are in the system, not outside of it. And that means you need to acknowledge that you're not neutral. And that's a way to start diversifying perspectives within your work, is to involve people who are stakeholders within the system, who have a lived understanding of what's happening in the system. Another thing Greg said earlier was that you need to have domain knowledge. And who better to have domain knowledge than people who are most affected by the system? And that's why I would encourage involving them. This is oftentimes called the participatory principle. Mike Jackson, in Toward a System of System Methodologies, he was a systems thinking scientist in the 1960s and 70s, said, if possible, all the stakeholders should participate in the various phases of the planning process. Stakeholders here include representatives of the purposeful parts of the system and of the larger system. So this also means engaging stakeholders like lived experts, those who are most affected by the system. For example, like I work in education, so oftentimes this means involving students and teachers, like those who are in the classroom in designing for the future. So again, Mike Jackson says, the idealized future is a statement of the system the planners and stakeholders would create if they were free to create any system they wanted. If pursued positively, this can lead to the interests of the different parts of the organization itself, and of the wider society being reconciled. So a good example of this is work that my team and I did with post-secondary students to help share their experiences with product developers in higher ed institutions. I actually have kind of like a bone to pick with personas because I feel like they're pretty reductive. But what we did here instead is worked alongside, co-designed a set of qualities which others could create personas that reflected the experiences of these marginalized students that we engaged. So through this process, we engaged lived experts, research as experts, so subject matter experts in our work who can inform our understanding of experiences as well as their purview of the system itself. So again, going back to that need to have domain knowledge, whether you're a lived expert or whether you're a researcher who understands the system of education that we're trying to have an impact in. So we not only conducted foundational research to help understand the patterns in students' experiences, but also engaged with them to design the toolkit itself, empowering them in the design process to not only share their experience, but to imagine the future, how this tool will be used and what kinds of futures it could inform. And so as you can see, we were doing systems thinking exercises with lived experts throughout this work. So not just like going away and doing analysis, but doing this in community with the people with whom we are designing. So keeping in mind the idea of expanding your idea of stakeholders, involving them in the process, we might return to this design thinking diagram with this 5 steps. For systems thinking, I want to expand this notion of process and who's involved. So picture the design thinking process as a subset of a larger systems design process. I've added expand to describe the process of expanding your notion of the system beyond just your area of concern. This could include mapping the status quo in, a causal loop diagram or the iceberg diagram or what have you. It's then followed by imagine, where you'll identify potential points of intervention in the system and ask yourself, are there different levels at which interventions can occur? Interventions could include possibilities beyond the realm of user-centered design, such as policy, business models, services, or long-term strategy. And then lastly, there's evaluate and determine the impact of the change to the system, not just by measuring it, but by being cognizant of the consequences. So one thing to acknowledge that when truly engaging with the system and the stakeholders, there will not be a singular solution or intervention. Rather, there'll be multiple types of interventions, some of which fall outside of the design process. So this might be a little bit of a misrepresentation that you have like 4 design processes, but there could be other things too, like developing policy, which falls outside of the design process. This notion is referred to as multi-finality in the systems thinking process. So there's no one way that a problem can be solved. So just to sum up, some of the ways you can adopt a systems thinking mindset is to keep these things in mind. Make the invisible visible. Remember that today's problems come from yesterday's solution, and diversify and empower your stakeholders. I want to talk a little bit about what brought me to systems thinking. I run an equity-centered design practice focused on education and impact. So this means trying to improve educational outcomes for kids who have less of a chance than other kids, those who suffer racial discrimination, poverty, displacement, those who are marginalized in today's system. What systems thinking helps me and my team do is to question the framing, question the status quo, and not just take it for granted. My practice often intersects as well with the future of education. But in order to plan for the future, we need to understand its history. So the history of systemic racism, misogyny, colonization, things that today can be disrupted and we can chip away at by understanding context at a systemic level. Many of you are familiar with this William Gibson quote, "The future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed." And it reminds me why systemic change is so important. We can work to create a more equitable world, and it means fundamentally disrupting the status quo and not just working in service of it. Dr. Bettina Love, who writes about educational freedom, coined the term freedom dreaming. And I love this term and use it a lot when we're working with students because it's dreaming about a system that is free from today's oppression. And I think that's what we need to do when we adopt a systems thinking mindset, is dream about and move the needle towards systemic change. So I'm sure that you too have lots of things you care about from a values perspective, an impact perspective, et cetera. And you don't have to trade off on those things. So I want to ask you, how do you see yourself using systems thinking? Thank you so much. And here's the little discount code for my book if you're interested in reading it. I think Lou Rosenfeld would be very pleased if some of you are interested in reading it. And this is my handle for Twitter, and please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And thank you so much for listening and learning about what it takes to adopt a systems thinking mindset.